The harsh screech of metal scraping earth jolted me awake before dawn had even touched the sky. At first, I assumed it was a stray animal and maybe raccoons again. But when I glanced out the front window, I saw two women in wide-brimmed sun hats and matching leopard print leggings digging a snaking trench straight through my neatly trimmed lawn, as if they were breaking ground for a public project. I nearly dropped my coffee. One of them was stabbing the soil with a garden spade while the other arranged makeshift construction markers on pink spray-painted wine bottles. That's when it hit me, this wasn't a joke. This was actually happening. The infamous Karen's sister CS. That's what the whole neighborhood called Thama had apparently decided that my yard was the perfect place for their new shortcut path. And the most absurd part, they were smiling and waving at me, like I should be thanking them. I stood motionless, trying to make sense of the madness unfolding before me. These weren't just your run-of-the-mill neighbors. These were the self-crowned rulers of the Ho. Karen Onia Chirila had somehow become the president of the association, a title she secured with just 3 votes during an underattended potluck. Her younger sister, Karen Lorna, who insisted on being called Lo, carried the equally bizarre title of Director of Aesthetic Pathways. I chuckled when I first saw that on the newsletter, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. Now here they were, carving a meandering path through my front yard like they were redesigning a public garden. I stepped outside, trying my best to stay calm even as my left eye started twitching. Mind telling me what this is about? I asked. Cheryl didn't even bother to look up. She kept digging and casually replied, "Making improvements, honey. People need a better route to the dog park. This shortcut saves at least 15 steps. We're thinking of naming it Karen's Trail." Lorna, busy positioning flamingo-shaped garden stakes with dramatic flair, beamed proudly. "It's for the neighborhood," she added. "You should feel honored to be part of something meaningful." I blinked, trying to comprehend what I was hearing. "You're digging through my property." Cheryl finally stood up with an exaggerated sigh. "Your property? Oh please. This is classified as a shared buffer zone." It was in the March Ho newsletter, page 6, right under the banana bread recipe. I shot back, "You mean the one no one read?" "Exactly," she said, smugly. "Look, if you've got a problem, go ahead and file a complaint." "But we already got verbal approval." "From who?" I asked. "From me," Cheryl said. "And from me," Lorna chimed in, pointing at herself. I honestly felt like I was losing my mind. They actually believed this was completely justified. I pulled out my phone, snapped pictures of the trench, their tools, and the ridiculous flamingos, and informed them I'd be contacting the city. Cheryl just shrugged. "Do what you need to do. This trail's going to be a neighborhood favorite." That line echoed in my head for the rest of the day. I didn't know whether to laugh, scream, or cry. So I started asking around. Turns out the Karens had been whispering about this shortcut plan for a week. They'd pitched it as a way to raise property values and bring neighbors closer together. But no one knew that meant slicing straight through my lawn. One neighbor admitted she thought they were just adding benches along the sidewalk. Another said she didn't dare say no to Chirila. This is the same woman who once fined her for hanging a beach towel over her porch railing. Cheryl and Lorna had twisted the concept of community into a power play. And now, their empire building had started with my grass. Later that day, a yellow notice appeared in my mailbox. A non-compliance warning from the Ho. I was apparently obstructing a beautification project. They fined me $200 for disrupting community flow. I actually laughed out loud when I read that. Obstruction of flow? What did they think I was? A dam? But my amusement vanished quickly. They weren't kidding. They were using the Ho like a weapon, distorting its rules to serve their own ambitions. And if I didn't push back, they'd just keep digging, both metaphorically and literally. The next morning, the trench had grown. The Karens were back, this time with wheelbarrows. They'd even brought a Bluetooth speaker and were blasting motivational music while they worked. At one point, Lorna filmed herself giving a progress update like she was hosting some kind of home improvement show. "Welcome to day 2 of Karen's Trail," she announced to her phone. "We're nearly halfway to the sidewalk. Huge thanks to Cheryl for selecting the gravel." I nearly choked on my coffee. Gravel? These lunatics weren't just digging it, they were preparing to lay down a finished surface. I called the city to report it. code enforcement said they'd look into it but warned the process could take weeks. The guy on the line actually chuckled and said, "Let me guess, a whole ladies with too much free time?" I let out a long sigh. "You don't even know the half of it." Later that same day, my neighbor Jim discreetly slid a folded note under my front door. It said, "They told me the stone goes down Friday. You didn't hear this from me." When I peeked outside, there was Jim casually watering his grass like he hadn't just delivered classified intel. By then, Cheryl and Lorna had started inviting people to use the so-called trail. Unaware of the situation, a few neighbors strolled through with their dogs or kids. Every footstep mashed more dirt into my yard, flowers were crushed, and my once beautiful landscaping was being trampled to death. It felt like watching a slow-motion invasion of everything I had worked so hard to maintain. To make it worse, every time I brought it up, they'd smile like I was the unreasonable one. Cheryl even told me I was being anti-community and needed to check my privilege and let others enjoy the space. That same afternoon, she planted a tiny flag in my yard that read "Freedom to Roam." By Thursday, the whole thing had become a full-blown spectacle. People were walking through like it was a nature preserve. Lorna handed out popsicles to kids passing by. A local dog trainer even brought an entire obedience class. My front yard, once the pride of the block, now looked like the muddy warm-up zone of a county fair. Staring out the window, I knew something had to change, and fast. The hoe wouldn't help. The city was moving at a snail's pace. And the currents? They were beyond logic. But I had one last movie, one ace I hadn't played. Something drastic, something permanent. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I made a phone call to an old friend who owed me a favor. He worked in commercial concrete, big jobs, fast turnarounds. "How soon can you get a crew and a truck out here?" I asked. "What are we pouring?" He asked. "Revenge," I said. "About 5 inches thick." He laughed. "I like it." "Midnight work for you?" I looked outside at the trench that now spanned my entire lawn like a battle scar. "Midnight's perfect," I said. "Let's make sure it's dry by morning." And that was it. The plan was set. If the Karns wanted a trail, they were about to get Onia, but not the kind they imagined. As the hour neared, I waited in my garage, sipping something cold and staring at the destruction carved into my grass. The Karns had no idea what was about to happen. Their meandering little dirt path, winding from the curb to my hedges like a child's doodle, was about to become something else entirely, an unwavering ribbon of concrete, solid as my resolve. I'd spent the day in quiet preparation. I ordered the materials, mapped out the trench in a way that was legally sound, and coordinated everything with my friend Nate. I didn't just want revenge, I wanted lasting justice, the kind that came with permits and boundary lines. Nate showed up with a 2-man crew, a rumbling cement mixer affectionately called Big Bertha, and a half-dozen halogen work lights. As they set up, I went over the plan again. We weren't just filling in a hole, we were installing a topped-air walkway, edged, graded for drainage, and textured for grip. The best part? It was entirely on my property, legally approved, and designated for private use. By the time Cheryl and Lorna woke up, their shortcut would be locked in a completely transformed, and there'd be nothing they could do about it. This was no sabotage. This was restoration, with a little artistic flair. Nate chuckled when he noticed the pink flamingo stakes still lining the trench. "Want me to leave room for these?" he asked with a smirk. "Absolutely not," I replied. "In fact, toss them in the mixer. Let them be immortalized as gravel." One of the guys laughed and started yanking up the ridiculous decorations, tossing them into a bin like old junk. The whole night had a charged stillness to it, quiet but electric, the kind of tension you feel right before lightning hits. We moved fast. Nate's crew leveled the trench, and Big Bertha rumbled into action, churning out thick cement that flowed into the trench like frosting on a cake of poetic justice. I stood nearby, flashlight in hand, watching the surface go smooth with each pass. It was oddly satisfying, like I was finally taking my space back. For the first time all week, I wasn't on defense. I wasn't reacting. I was reclaiming. As we neared the last stretch, I pulled out a small stencil I had cut earlier that day. It said, "Private property and no public access." Nate raised an eyebrow and grinned. "Nice touch." I didn't step on the cement, Cheryl would later claim. That evening, I reviewed the footage, clipped the most telling moments, and uploaded it to a private neighborhood thread titled Property Restoration Progress. I didn't add commentary. No captions. No explanations. Just the raw video. Within hours, reactions started rolling in. Some neighbors laughed. Others applauded the effort. A few remained silent, but the shift was undeniable. Public opinion was changing. By nightfall, Cheryl and Lorna had vanished from sight. Their so-called trail had been erased both physically and symbolically. And as I sat on my porch with a cold drink in hand, watching the concrete set under the warm glow of the setting sun, I knew this was just the opening move. The Carns weren't done, not even close, but neither was I. And now, I had the upper hand, literally laid in stone. The next morning, the footprints became something of a neighborhood art installation. Passers-by would slow down, tilt their heads, and smirk at the unmistakable outline of fuzzy slippers stamped into the surfacing right next to the now solidified rake handle, poking out like a monument to hubris. No one said anything outright, but the chuckles and knowing glances said plenty. Even the mailman, who had never acknowledged me beyond a head nod, gave me a thumbs up and said, "Nice job." Someone finally stood up to them. Of course, not everyone was a fan. Around noon, a folded letter showed up under my doormat. It was printed in Comic Sans, of all things, complete with a pixelated whole logo and addressed to me with my first name spelled wrong. The tone read like legalese written by someone who learned about lawsuits from soap operas. Apparently, Cheryl was in full damage control mode. The letter accused me of willfully impeding communal flow, environmental misconduct, and even emotional harm. Lorna, it claimed, had twisted her ankle while retreating from the scene and would be filing a formal grievance. There was no signature, just a final line in bold. "We will see you in community court." Community court? Was that some whole version of Judge Judy? I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. And absurdity becomes dangerous when mixed with wounded pride. Cheryl and Lorna weren't just embarrassed, they were boxed in. And people like that don't back down quietly. They escalate, they scheme, they go for round two. Sure enough, later that night, the whole Facebook group lit up with dramatic posts, thinly veiled complaints about hostile homeowners, territorial behavior, and individuals who refused to embrace unity. One blurry photo showed the concrete trail at a crooked angle, with a caption claiming it was hazardous, slippery, and hostile to strollers and seniors. A few of Cheryl's loyalists chimed in with sympathy, but the dominant tone of the thread leaned toward entertainment. One comment stood out: "Looks safer than the mud pit we had last week. Maybe it's time to leave the guy alone." That didn't stop Cheryl and Lorna from mounting a fresh offensive. 2 days later, I pulled into my driveway and found a group of people clustered near the edge of my yard. Cheryl, back in performance mode, was passionately recounting her version of events. Clipboard-wielding guests nodded as she pointed toward the concrete path, theatrically tracing the original trail and dramatically gesturing at the preserved footprints. "That's my slipper mark," she declared, as if it were a badge of honor. Turns out the clipboard crew was a couple from the Ho Oversight Committee dragged out for what Cheryl had dubbed a community impact assessment. I stepped into the gathering silently, arms crossed, and waited. When Cheryl noticed me, her expression twisted into the tense, artificial smile she used during home meetings when she wanted to seem civil but was seconds from a meltdown. "Good afternoon," I said evenly. "You must be here to inspect the recently restored portion of my yard." One of the committee members looked puzzled. "Restored?" Cheryl jumped in. "Illegally altered. It used to be a shared trail until he destroyed it without consulting anyone." Without saying a word, I pulled out a laminated copy of the official city property survey and handed it over. "Actually, the so-called trail was dug across my property without my consent," I said. "The new path, it's fully within my boundary, permitted, and inspected. I've got the stamped sign-off if you'd like to see it." Cheryl's jaw tightened like a vice. The couple skimmed the paperwork, flipping pages, comparing notes, then exchanged a quiet glance. One of the Oversight Committee members finally broke the silence. "Mr. Hale is within his rights. The concrete path is compliant, and the signs are clearly visible." Cheryl made one last, desperate attempt. "But what about the emotional impact? Kids used to run through here. It was a broken bar. It was a joy trail." I raised an eyebrow. A joint rail. It was a ditch with plastic flamingos. And your sister embedded a rake in my lawn. The female inspector tried to suppress a laugh but coughed it away and said, "All right, that's enough, thank you, both." They packed up and left. Cheryl followed, but not before glaring at me like I'd kicked her puppy. The rake, now fully set into the concrete like a relic from some petty archaeological dig, took on a life of its own. Someone had glued googly eyes to it. A few days later, a small gnome appeared beside it holding a handmade sign, "Trail closed." What was supposed to be a battleground had become a neighborhood landmark, a one carved from stubbornness and sealed with poetic justice. But I knew better than to think Cheryl would let it go. She'd spent too long tasting power to walk away without a fight. That weekend, the situation escalated. I received a letter on real paper, no less from what claimed to be an attorney's office, though between the pixelated letterhead and high school grammar, I wasn't sure whether it came from a real lawyer or someone who thought Judge Judy counted as legal precedent. The accusations: obstructing a community walkway, violating neighborhood harmony, and my personal favorite, causing emotional distress by impeding the civil liberty of walkspace. I forwarded the letter to Melanie, my actual attorney and longtime friend. She called me 5 minutes later, barely able to breathe from laughing. "This reads like it was drafted by a teenager using and caffeine," she said. "You want me to reply?" "Yes," I said, sharp but civil. "Let's not just weena, let's do it with flair." While Melanie handled the legal theatrics, I turned my attention to the path itself. I installed soft solar lights along the edge, planted a border of hardy flowers, and added a small decorative bench. The path was no longer just a slog, it was a statement, a message. I'm not backing down. Then, something unexpected happened. A small, unmarked package arrived with only a P.O. box for return address. Inside was a single printed photo, a picture of me, captured mid-pour under the glow of halogen lights. The angle suggested it had been taken from across the street. No note, no context, just the image. Someone had been watching. At first, I assumed it was Cheryl trying to spook me, but then I remembered she'd been out of town that night, attending a regional whole leadership summit. That meant the photo wasn't from her. Someone else had been observing, someone who hadn't spoken until now. That gave me pause. That night, I walked out onto the porch and scanned the homes across the street. Lights behind windows, shadows behind blinds. Someone out there had seen everything. Maybe it was Jim of the neighborhood slipped me the tip-off note, or maybe it was someone else entirely. Whoever it was, their silence had meaning. It meant this wasn't just a personal feud anymore. It had become theater. And the neighborhood? They weren't just watching it, they were choosing sides. Cheryl and Lorna may have started it, but now, every move was under silent scrutiny. The irony? For all their talk about building community, they'd never actually asked the community what it wanted. They just assumed they were the community. And that arrogance, a broken bar was starting to collapse beneath them. As dusk painted the sky in gold, I sat on my porch once more, iced tea in hand, watching the concrete path glow under the soft amber of solar lights. It wasn't just a walkway anymore. It was a line, a boundary that had been crossed, a mark I had rebuilt, stronger than before. And I had a feeling that line was going to mean a whole lot more soon, because the Karens weren't finished. If I'd learned anything by now, it was this: Cheryl and Lorna never backed down quietly. They liked to escalate, but this time, I was ready. The peace didn't last. They vanished for a couple of days, and while that should have been a relief, it felt more like the quiet center of a brewing storm. They weren't retreating, they were reloading. I watched the Ho forum. I monitored the neighborhood Facebook group. I even checked the city permit site daily, waiting for the next move. It finally arrived. Thursday morning, I stepped out to grab the paper and found a notice taped to my mailbox, freshly stamped with the Ho seal. It accused me of installing an unauthorized hardscape edition that clashed with neighborhood aesthetics. They had invented a brand new violation, and I had no doubt who wrote it. I marched down to the Ho office, a glorified cubicle above the bakery, and walked in. Cheryl sat behind a folding table, typing with all the concentration of someone launching a missile. Lorna lounged beside her, sipping iced coffee and scrolling on a tablet with a smug grin. "Ah, Mr. Hale," Cheryl said without looking up, her voice dripping with forced politeness. Without even glancing up, Cheryl said, "I assume you're here about the notice." "I am," I replied, "and I'd love to know exactly which rule I supposedly violated this time." She finally looked up, her expression smug. Subsection B7, page 4. The visual harmony clause. It clearly states that all exterior alterations must align with the neighborhood's aesthetic. That clause doesn't exist, I replied flatly. "It does now," Lorna chimed in, waving her tablet like it was a gavel. "We added it during an emergency HO session 2 nights ago." "You mean the one you held without informing any homeowners?" I asked. Cheryl smirked. "We notified the board. That's all the bylaws require." It was so blatant I nearly laughed, but instead, I calmly pulled out a copy of my city-approved permit and laid it on the table. "This document overrides your secret meeting," I said. "Push this, and I'll have my attorney file harassment charges." Cheryl glanced at the permit but didn't touch it. "This isn't a legal issue," she said. "It's a community matter." "Then let the community decide," I said evenly. "Let's put it to a vote." Her jaw twitched. "Fine," she said, "but you should know there's still a pending complaint about the injury caused by your cement." "You mean the one that happened when you stepped onto wet concrete on private property?" I asked. "That's your version," she snapped, standing up. "We'll see what the board thinks." Back at home, I realized this was more than a property dispute. Cheryl and Lorna had manipulated the HO for far too long, bending rules, creating new ones, and turning neighbor against neighbor. This wasn't just about my walkway anymore. It was about dismantling their grip on the entire street. So, I got to work. I gathered everything: emails, photos, video footage of the trench digging, screenshots of their Facebook posts, even the hilariously amateur cease and desist letter. I contacted neighbors who had quietly supported me, like Jim and the elderly couple a few doors down. When I explained what I planned to bring to the next home meeting, every response was the same. Finally, the night of the meeting, the room was packed. Not just board members, but homeowners, some of whom hadn't shown up in years. Word had spread. The cement incident had struck a chord. People were done with arbitrary fines for flower pot colors, threats over wind chimes, and constant power plays disguised as community standards. Cheryl stood at the front like a dictator holding court, clipboard clutched tight, Lorna whispering beside her like some shadowy advisor. "Let's begin," Cheryl said. "We're here to vote on the unauthorized hardscape alteration at Lot 112. "Hold on," came a voice from the back. It was Mr. Quanah, the retired engineer who never spoke at meetings. "Shouldn't we hear the full story first?" Cheryl faltered, just for a moment. Then she nodded stiffly. "Fine, but be brief." I stood up and walked to the front, speaking plainly. I didn't yell, I didn't gesture wildly, I just presented the facts. I showed video of Cheryl and Lorna digging up my lawn without permission. I played clips of them stomping through wet cement. I held up screenshots of their bragging social media posts and passed out copies of my city permit. I even played a voicemail from my lawyer, explaining that the installation was fully legal and protected under city ordinance. Silence followed. Then, a soft clap. Mrs. Green, of the sweet widow who walked her poodle past my yard every morning, was applauding. One by one, others joined. Cheryl jumped in, her voice rising. "This isn't just about legality, it's about preserving harmony." "No," Jim interrupted. "It's about the two of you using the hoe to bully this entire street." A rumble of agreement swept the room. "You fined me for having a pumpkin out in November," someone shouted. "You tried to charge me because my kids drew chalk on the sidewalk," added another. The energy had shifted. Cheryl's mask cracked. She tried to smile, but her eyes betrayed panic. "We're just trying to uphold neighborhood standards," she said through gritted teeth. "No," I said calmly, "you're just trying to hold on to control." When the board finally voted, it was unanimous. My cement path was upheld as fully valid and legally protected. And in a stunning move, a second vote passed. Cheryl and Lorna were suspended from all HO decision-making pending an independent review. A temporary committee was formed, and for the first time in years, the applause at an home meeting wasn't sarcastic, it was real. Cheryl and Lorna stormed out, muttering about mob rule and ungrateful residents. I stepped outside, exhausted but victorious. I felt a wave of relief. I had stood up to Thema, and this time, The neighborhood had stood with me, but just as I stepped onto my driveway, something caught my eye, a puddle near the base of the cement path. Strange. It hadn't drained. I crouched down to get a better look. It wasn't water, it was a thin stream of muddy runoff. I grabbed a flashlight and followed the trail, weaving along the edge of my lawn, down toward the back fence. Then I saw it. A narrow trench had been dug just beyond my property line, running straight from Cheryl and Lorna's garden to the base of my yard. It was shallow, but unmistakably man-made, like a mini canal, carefully carved to funnel excess water directly onto my land. I stood there, stunned. After everything of the meeting, the vote, the footage, they were still at it. When they couldn't beat me with fake rules and Facebook drama, they turned to sabotage. Only this time, they were playing with city code. Diverting storm runoff wasn't just petty, it was illegal. It could destabilize the landscaping, erode the path, and destroy the yard I'd spent years maintaining. I took pictures, video, even grabbed a few water samples for good measure. The next morning, I called in a city drainage inspector. I showed him everything. After a brief inspection, he shook his head. "This isn't natural erosion," he said. "Someone shaped this deliberately." You'd be surprised how many neighbor feuds turn into water wars. "So what happens now?" I asked. "I'll file a formal report," he replied. "If they don't remove it, they'll face steep fines, and you're well within your rights to sue for damages." Later that evening, Cheryl stormed across my lawn, her heels sinking slightly into the soft grass. "You sent a city guy to snoop through my garden?" she snapped. "I had a drainage inspector assess an illegal runoff trench that happens to cross into my property," I replied. "Which you dug." "Again, this is harassment," she hissed. "You're targeting us." "No," I said. "You're violating city code." Again, she retreated, fuming, but this time, I didn't feel anxious. I wasn't playing defense anymore. Every move she made just buried her deeper. The foundation was already set literally and legally. But the next morning, I was greeted by something even more absurd. The sound of heavy machinery. For a second, I thought the city had sent a crew to start filling in the trench. I pulled back the curtains and then nearly dropped my coffee. Across Cheryl and Lorna's driveway sat a rented mini excavator. And at the controls, Lorna. She wore an oversized reflective vest, a bike helmet strapped on like she was preparing for battle. Cheryl stood beside her, arms flailing like a deranged air traffic controller. A little deeper. She yelled, "Make it slope, we need faster runoff." I blinked in disbelief. They were actually expanding the trench in broad daylight, in front of the entire street, as if launching a public infrastructure project. I grabbed my phone and hit record. It was like performance art in the genre of unhinged suburban sabotage. Lorna fumbled with the excavator's controls, gouging the earth into a jagged canyon, while Cheryl ran around planting tiny yard flags, declaring them part of the natural water flow zone. To complete the scene, they turned on their garden hose and started channeling water through the trench once again straight into my flower bed. That's when it clicked. They weren't just trying to ruin my yard, they were trying to erode the cement path, hoping water damage would succeed where fake bylaws had failed. I sent the footage directly to the drainage inspector. Within hours, he returned with 2 city code enforcement officers in tow. Cheryl was mid-sentence, lecturing a neighbor about eco-symbiotic irrigation, when one of the officers cut her off. "Ma'am, you can't conduct hydrological modifications across private property without permits." Cheryl tried to pivot, mumbling something about native landscaping and water sovereignty. Lorna yelled about a documentary she saw on drought-resistant gardening. The officers were unmoved. By that afternoon, the trench had been ruled a code violation. The excavator was towed away. Cheryl and Lorna were slapped with citations for unauthorized land modification, illegal runoff redirection, and property damage. But even that didn't stop them. That night, I caught Lorna crouched near the cement path again, holding what looked like a bottle of vinegar. I stepped onto the porch and cleared my throat. She froze, dropped the bottle, and bolted, tripping over one of her own abandoned flamingo decorations on the way out. I could have called the police, could have pressed charges, but I didn't. Instead, I handed the footage to Melanie, my attorney. She had already compiled a dense dossier: violations, threats, illegal modifications, trespassing attempts, surveillance captures, screenshots of whole abuse. Now she added environmental sabotage. By the end of the week, a formal civil lawsuit was filed. The charges: property damage, harassment, emotional distress. It wasn't $1 million Cassie, but it was enough to sting. And based on the high-pitched screaming I heard echoing from Cheryl's kitchen window the morning the papers were served, a broken bar, it was already working. The lawsuit had an unexpected ripple effect. At first, it was quiet. Side comments at the mailbox, anonymous notes slipped under doors, late-night texts from numbers I didn't recognize. But then it got louder. Neighbors started coming forward with their own stories about Cheryl and Lorna, stories that had been quietly endured for years. One woman confessed she'd been fined for wind chimes that interfered with neighborhood tranquility. Another revealed that Cheryl once tried to ban outdoor furniture that didn't match the architecture of the house. Someone else was cited for using a beach umbrella on their lawn. The stories kept coming. For the first time, people realized they weren't alone. The silent majority finally had someone to rally behind, and that momentum sparked something even bigger: a call for a full HO audit and a special election. Cheryl and Lorna had ruled the board like a personal kingdom, writing rules, ignoring complaints, silencing dissent. But now, the kingdom was crumbling. In just a few days, enough signatures were collected, the paperwork was filed, a new election was scheduled. The Karn's reign was unraveling faster than even I expected. The night of the vote felt like the climax of a courtroom drama. Folding chairs lined the local community center. Nearly every homeowner showed up. The room buzzed with tension. You could feel something shifting in the air. Cheryl walked in late, dressed like she was on trial, a gray blazer, pearl necklace, manila folder clutched like a legal weapon. Lorna followed, arms crossed, glaring at every person who dared look her way. When the floor opened for public comment, neighbor after neighbor stood up, not angry, not theatrical, just calm, honest, and clear. One by one, they shared what they had endured under Cheryl and Lorna's rule. I didn't even need to speak. The damage spoke for itself. When the votes were counted, the result was decisive. Cheryl and Lorna were removed from all HO positions. A new board was elected, diverse, reasonable, willing to listen. As the results were read aloud, Cheryl stood frozen, her lips pressed so tightly they almost disappeared. Rage and disbelief battled on her face. Lorna muttered something about suing the entire neighborhood and stormed out, knocking over a trash can on the way. No one followed. A week later, my cement path got a fresh coat of sealant and some new solar lights lining its edges. The embedded rake stayed. Of course, it had become more than a mistake. It was a neighborhood monument, a visual punchline, a little slab of justice. I even added a small plaque near the entrance. Community begins with respect. People laughed when they saw Ida, but they got the message. The funniest part, a few neighbors actually asked if they could replicate the design in their own yards. One even offered to pay me for layout consulting. I wasn't a landscaper, but I'll admit it felt good. The thing Cheryl and Lorna tried so hard to destroy had become a source of inspiration. The cement wasn't just hardened concrete anymore. It was a turning point, a line in the sand that didn't just hold, it held back the storm. By the end of the month, Cheryl quietly listed her house for sale. Word spread fast that she couldn't walk down the street without getting side-eyed. Lorna tried to stir up one last round of drama in the HO Facebook group, but no one bit. Her posts sat there, untouched. Eventually, she deleted her account. They didn't go out in flames. They faded with a whimper, cemented in memory as a cautionary tale. And me, life returned to normal. Laughter floated across the street again. Chalk drawings reappeared on sidewalks. Neighbors waved without glancing over their shoulders. The fear of fines and citations finally lifted. Sometimes someone would bring up the whole ordeal and laugh. "I still can't believe they tried to dig a trench through your yard." And I'd grin and reply, "Yeah, and I still can't believe it only took cement to stop them." This story was never about revenge. It didn't require yelling or threats, just boundaries. Clear, firm, unapologetic, because when entitled people push too far, they don't need drama, they need a reminder. Sometimes, all it takes is a well-placed slab of concrete to prove the world doesn't revolve around their shortcut. And in this neighborhood, that line had been drawn, permanently.